The year was 1879. Kestrel Ridge was not a town. It was a wound in the earth that refused to close. Clinging to the high, dry shoulder of the territory, the wind, its only constant resident, never ceased its argument, carrying the taste of alkali dust and the faint, bitter smell of thirsty cattle. It was a place built on the bones of failed prospectors and fueled by the desperation of those who had nowhere else to fall. Inside the prospector's lantern, the air was a solid thing, layered with the sediment of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, acidic tang of failure. It was just past 5 in the afternoon, but the shadows were already long and blue, creeping in from the corners. Mara Whitlock sat at the table in the deepest shadow, the one usually reserved for poker cheats or men waiting for a bullet. Her back was not to the wall, but to the thin partition that separated the saloon from the telegraph office next door. That office was her domain, a world of brass keys and electrical impulses, but this saloon was the battlefield. Her hands, usually so quick and precise on the telegraph key, were perfectly still on the tabletop, palms down. Opposite her sat Dorian Pike. If Kestrel Ridge was a wound, Pike was the infection. He owned the Argent Crown Mining Company. In this territory, that meant he owned the water, the deputies, and the air rights. He was a man built of brisket and certainty. His bulk poured into a black broadcloth suit and a gray waistcoat that cost more than the saloon's entire inventory of whiskey. His beard was trimmed, his hands were clean, and his eyes were the color of wet slate. Pike did not speak. He reached into that expensive waistcoat, his thumb and forefinger disappearing into a small pocket. He produced a single, heavy gold coin, a $20 double eagle. He did not toss it. He placed it flat on the scarred geography of the tabletop and, with one clean fingernail, pushed it. The coin slid across the dark wood, spinning lazily through a patch of grime. It glinted in the last shaft of sunlight penetrating the saloon's dusty window, a flash of pure, corrupting gold. As it turned, the light caught a dark smear near the embossed eagle, a small, stubborn stain that had resisted polishing. It was rust brown, the color of old blood. It was a mark left intentionally, a signature. This coin, or one just like it, had bought silence before. The permanent kind. The coin spun to a stop, resting an inch from Mara's right hand. Mara looked at the gold. She saw the brown stain. She saw the face of the last person rumored to have been offered such a deal, a witness named Odette Maris, who had vanished 2 months prior, leaving only a half-finished laundry line. Mara slowly pulled her hands back from the table, retracting them from the coin's orbit, and folded them in her lap. Her voice was not loud, but it was as clear as winter ice. It cut through the low, buzzing drone of the saloon. I'd rather die. The effect was as immediate and as total as a gunshot. A glass, halfway to a miner's mouth, paused in midair. The scrape of a boot on the floorboards went still. In the far corner, the piano player, a man called Silas who only knew 3 songs and played them all badly, fumbled a chord. The notes hung in the air, sour and incomplete. He lifted his hands from the keys, and the silence that rushed in was heavy as wet wool. The only sounds left were the high, lonely whine of the wind pressing against the shutters and the rhythmic, labored tick-tick-tick of the faulty wall clock. Every eye in the prospector's lantern, 20 pairs at least, swung toward the corner table. They had seen men threatened. They had seen guns drawn over marked cards. They had never, not once, seen Dorian Pike refused. Leaning against a structural post near the batwing doors, Asher Voss did not appear to move. He looked like just another drifter, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat, his frame long and lean in a dusty coat. But Asher was not looking at Mara, or even at Pike. His eyes, sharp and gray as flint, were moving. He noted the back door, currently blocked by 2 freight haulers arguing over credit. He noted the window behind the bar, too high to climb but wide enough to shoot through. He noted the exact 3 feet of space between Pike's chair and the wall, and the 2 men who occupied the table nearest to them. He was a man who understood angles and exits. He had been a surveyor for the Union Army, mapping terrain under fire, and the habit of calculating escape routes had never left him. He registered the 2 men flanking Pike's table. They were not part of the saloon's usual debris. Those 2 men were Cassidy Rourke and Maddox Hale. Rourke was thin as a rail, a consumptive cough rattling in his chest, but his eyes were quick and his hands never strayed far from the pistols tucked into his waistband. Hale was the muscle, a heavy, slow man who looked like he had been carved from damp wood, and who enjoyed his work. At Mara's words, they shifted. It was not an obvious draw. It was the subtle, deliberate scrape of chair legs on the floorboards. They moved their seats, not forward, but outward, widening their stance, closing the invisible ring around the table. They were creating a perimeter, a kill box, cutting Mara off from the rest of the room. Rourke smiled, a yellow-toothed expression meant to be reassuring but failing utterly. They were trying to push Mara back into the box of reasonable negotiation with the silent promise of violence. Mara ignored them. She kept her gaze fixed on Pike, whose placid expression had not flickered. Her refusal still hung in the air, a physical object he had not anticipated. Slowly, she reached not for a weapon, but into the small leather satchel at her hip. Pike's eyes narrowed. Rourke's hand drifted from his lapel to his coat, closer to the pistol. Mara produced a single piece of folded paper, creased and heavy. It was sealed not with wax, but with the thick, resinous sap of a pinyon pine, and stamped with the distinct, circular imprint of a telegraph key. She placed it on the table, directly on top of the blood-stained coin. The paper covered the gold completely, extinguishing its light. Pike knew that seal. This was not a rumor from a drunk miner. This was not a whispered complaint from a bankrupt farmer. This was hard copy. This was the proof, transcribed by her own hand, of the Argent Crown's secret accounts, the ones that detailed the payments for the illegal dam and the diversion of the Gallows Bend River, the theft of water that was choking the valley dry. As if the tension itself had summoned it, the front bat-wing doors burst open. It was not a customer. It was the wind, a sudden, violent gust from the high plains. It howled into the saloon, a physical blow, carrying a flurry of red dust that stung the eyes. The gust was a trespasser. It extinguished half the kerosene lamps on the walls, plunging the room into a deep, uncertain twilight. The piano player cursed. Men shielded their drinks and pulled their hats low. In that sudden chaos and darkness, Asher Voss moved. His body uncoiled from the post. His hand dropped, fingers brushing the worn walnut grip of the Whitworth revolver holstered high on his hip. He was ready. But across the room, in the instant before the bartender could strike a new match, Mara saw the movement. She found Asher's silhouette in the gloom. She gave a single, sharp shake of her head. No, not this way. Not yet. This was her play, and it would be fought with ledgers, not lead. Asher's hand stilled, his fingers resting on the metal, but he did not relax. The bartender, sweating and muttering, got the main lamps burning again. The light returned, weak and yellow, painting the occupants in sickly hues. Rourke and Hale were standing now, their hands fully on their pistols, their chairs kicked back. Dorian Pike, however, had relaxed. He looked at the sealed paper that covered his coin. He looked at Mara's unflinching face. He leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice was a low whisper, meant only for her, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "You are a smart woman, Miss Whitlock. Too smart." He tapped the missive with a clean finger. "You think that paper matters to a circuit judge I pay for. It does not." He leaned closer, his shadow falling across her. "But Juniper Flats matters to you." The blood drained from Mara's face. It was the first sign of fear she had shown. Juniper Flats was 2 miles south of the ridge. It was not a ranch. It was a hard-luck farm, a place for women whose husbands had died in Pike's mines, a sanctuary for the children left behind. It was dust and stubborn hope, and it survived on a thin trickle of water from a spring Pike had, so far, deemed too insignificant to steal. "It is dry this season," Pike whispered, his breath smelling of whiskey and expensive cloves. "Very dry. A single spark, a dropped cigar from a careless rider. A tragedy." He smiled, a terrible motion that did not touch his eyes. "The wind is high tonight. It would be ash by morning." This was the true negotiation. Not the coin. This was the leverage. Rourke grinned, sensing the shift, the victory. Pike leaned back, the picture of calm reason, waiting for her to crumble, to reach for the coin, to trade her proof for the safety of the orphans. Mara sat still for a full 10 seconds. The clock ticked. The wind moaned. She looked at the sealed paper, then at Pike's victorious expression. Slowly, she picked up the small, heavy glass of rye whiskey she had not touched. She held it, not to drink, but as ballast, the cold glass grounding her. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, met his. They were not frightened. They were cold, cold as iron, and just as hard. "I am not selling my soul, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice clear and carrying. Once again, across the silent room, "I am here to collect." The debt was not singular. It was a braid of many, each strand pulled tight around Mara's throat. And it had begun 3 years prior, on an afternoon when the sky wept a rain the color of rust. Her father, Eben Whitlock, was the blacksmith. He was a man of quiet strength, his world defined by the predictable physics of fire and iron. He believed in the integrity of a good weld and the honesty of a hard day's work. He did not understand men who dealt in paper and whispers. When the fire broke out in the Argent Crown's No. 2 assay office, the one where the payroll ledgers were kept, Eben was the first to run toward it, his forge buckets in hand. He was the only one who ran toward it. Dorian Pike needed a scapegoat. The ledgers had shown a deficit, a deep hole where company money was supposed to be. A fire was a convenient audit. Pike's men found a tin of forge accelerant near the smoking timbers. It was Eben's tin, stolen from his shop 2 days earlier. The trial lasted less than an hour. It was held in the Prospector's Lantern, the same saloon where Mara now sat. Judge Wheeler, a man whose thirst was legendary and whose rulings were paid for by the ounce, presided. Pike's men, Hale and Rourke, provided the testimony. Mara had watched, 16 years old, standing in the back of the room. She watched her father, his face black with soot and confusion, try to explain. He had no words for this kind of treachery. They pronounced the sentence at 4 in the afternoon. They carried it out at 5, just as the muddy red rain began to fall. They used a new hemp rope from the company store, swinging him from the timber frame of the new mine head. Mara never cried. She just watched, her hands clenched so tight her nails left white crescents in her palms. That was the first debt. The second debt was to the land itself. After securing his charter, Dorian Pike and the Argent Crown Company did what the territory forbade. They dammed the Gallows Bend River. It was not a large dam, but it was a clever one. Built high in a box canyon, invisible to anyone not looking for it. It diverted 90% of the river's flow into a private reservoir, marked on no public map, to be used exclusively for the hydraulic sluices of the Argent Crown. The Redwater Basin, which had been a shallow, sprawling greenness of hardy grass and willow thickets, began to die. The creek beds turned to silt, then to cracked, gray polygons of baked mud. The farmers downstream, men who had broken the land with their bare hands, watched their corn wither on the stalk. Their cattle, hides stretched tight over skeletons, staggered to the dry riverbed and lay down. Too weak to rise, the basin became an open grave, and the dust of its death settled on Kestrel Ridge, a constant, gritty reminder. Pike was starving them, acre by acre. The third debt was the most personal. His name was Rowdy Lee. He had a lopsided smile and hands calloused from his work at the mine. And he had promised Mara a life away from the telegraph key. He was saving for a small ranch in the next valley, a place with its own spring. He had given her a small piece of blue turquoise, the color of water, on a leather cord. She wore it under her dress. Rowdy was a blaster. He knew dynamite. He also knew the support timbers in shaft number 4 were rotten. He had told the shift boss. He had told Maddox Hale. He was told to shut up and drill. The official report called it a cave-in, a tragic, unavoidable act of God. But the men who pulled his body from the rubble, men who were his friends, told a different story. They whispered it over whiskey in the darkest corners of the saloon. The timbers had not just failed, they had been cut. The blast pattern was wrong. It was not a cave-in. It was a deliberate, controlled explosion, set to silence the man who was making trouble about shaft safety. Rowdy Lee had become a line item under acceptable losses. Mara buried the turquoise with him. The debt braid was complete. Grief could drive a person to a bottle or a gun. It drove Mara to a brass key. She already worked the telegraph, a respectable job for a woman alone, tapping out shipping manifests and bank transfers. But after Rowdy died, she began to listen. She learned to filter the static, the atmospheric noise, the idle chatter of other operators down the line. She sat in the dark, long after her shift, her ear pressed to the receiver, the faint dit-dit-da, a secret language. Pike owned the mine, but he did not own the wire. His business traveled on it. She learned the rhythm of his operators, the specific fist or style of their tapping. She heard the coded messages setting the price of coal, undercutting his rivals. She heard the reports of cash flow problems, the transfers from banks in San Francisco, the schedules of the Argent Crown safe wagon. She heard the secret dispatches to Judge Wheeler, advising him when to be out of town on a hunting trip. She did not just listen, she began to write. In a cheap 5-cent notebook, she started her own ledger. It was not a book of numbers, but of sins. May 4th, 1877, Cassidy Rourke paid $20 to intimidate the land assessor. June 10th, 1877, Maddox Hale. Bonus of $50 for resolving the strike in Shaft 2. August 2nd, 1878, Judge Wheeler, $100, delivered by courier, for the verdict on the Redwater boundary dispute. And on the last page, a single entry, Dorian Pike. The rest of the page was blank. Waiting. She was not the only one whose life had been fractured by the Argent Crown. Asher Voss had come west after the war, his mind full of maps and equations. He was a surveyor, one of the best, and he saw the land as a problem of geometry, of elegant lines and elevations. The Argent Crown had hired him for a magnificent sum, his task to map the entire watershed of the territory, to find every underground spring, every aquifer, every hidden vein of water. He had been proud of his work. The maps were beautiful, intricate, and perfectly accurate. He delivered them to Pike's office. The next week, he watched as Pike's men, using his map as their guide, dynamited a spring that fed 3 downstream ranches, diverting the water into a company cistern. He saw his beautiful, elegant lines used not to build, but to steal. He saw his math turned into a weapon. Asher took his pay, rode his horse up into the desolate, winding maze of Dawnbreak Canyon, and tried to disappear. He had not drawn a map or a sober breath since. The coin Pike slid across the table was not just an insult. It was a pattern. The story of Odette Maris was one Mara had pieced together from whispers. Odette had been a cleaner at the mining office. She had seen something she should not have: a late-night meeting, a valise of cash, Judge Wheeler leaving by the back door. She was offered a coin, a $20 double eagle, stained with what looked like a spot of ink. She was told to take it and leave the territory for her health. Odette, a practical woman, took the gold. She was last seen riding the noon stage east. The stage arrived at its destination. But Odette Maris was not on it. The coin was a systemic poison, a way of marking a problem for disposal. All of this churned beneath the surface of the confrontation. The sealed missive Mara placed on the coin was not her full ledger. It was bait. It was a single, transcribed message detailing a water diversion, just enough to prove she knew something. She could not win in a kangaroo court. She could not win against Pike's guns. Her only chance was to force his hand, to make him acknowledge his crimes out loud. His threat against Juniper Flats was the error she had been waiting for. He had verbally, in a room full of witnesses, linked himself to the threat of arson and extortion, all to protect the secret of the illegal dam. He had confirmed the debt. The suffocating reality of Kestrel Ridge was the drought. It was a living entity, a predator stalking the town. The air was thin and hot, the sun a white-hot circle in a bleached-out sky. The sound of the town was the scrape of a dry bucket in a dry well, the splintering of wood as porch boards warped, the incessant, maddening whine of the wind. Every drop of water Pike stole from the basin and poured onto his gravel sluices was a sip of water taken from a thirsty child, a patch of skin flayed from the backs of the farmers. The tension in the prospector's lantern was not just about a woman defying a powerful man. It was the collective agony of a valley being bled to death, and Mara Whitlock had just presented the knife. The confrontation in the prospector's lantern was a declaration of war. Pike's threat against Juniper Flats had not been idle. Mara knew he was a man who preferred to burn his problems rather than solve them. She had left the saloon with the echo of that silence, the weight of every eye in the room, and the cold knowledge that her single missive was not enough. She had the accusation, but she needed the proof. Pike had left the coin on the table, a final, gleaming insult. In her anger, grabbing her own paper, she had swept it up as well. It was in her pocket, heavy as a stone. She returned to the telegraph office, the partition separating her from the saloon's noise a flimsy shield. She needed a new plan. The circuit judge, the Honorable Elias Wheeler, was due to hold a traveling court session at Bitterbrush Station, 60 miles south, in 3 days, if she could get real proof before him. Proof that implicated him as well as Pike. The public setting might be enough to force his hand, but she had nothing but her own transcriptions and a stained gold coin. 2 nights later, she was asleep on her cot in the back room when the sound jolted her awake. A click, a pause, click, click, click. She sat up, her heart pounding. The main line from the east was dead for the night. The local line was silent. This was something else. It was faint, piggybacking on the wire, a ghost of a signal. It was a slow, unsteady fist, the tapping rhythm of an amateur, someone unused to a key. Dit-da-dit, da-da-da, dit-dit-da. It was not Morse, not letters. She lit a lamp, her hands shaking slightly, and grabbed a pencil. She listened, transcribing the rhythmic groups. It was a cipher. She stared at the page for 10 minutes before she recognized it. It was not a code. It was a surveyor's coordinates. She ran to the large territorial map pinned to her wall, the one Asher Voss had drawn 3 years ago, before he had vanished into a bottle. She traced the lines. The coordinates pointed to a single, desolate spot, the old, decommissioned switchback bridge, 20 miles into the canyons. She returned to the key, her ear pressed to the receiver. The strange signal stopped. Then, a new message began. This one in clear, simple Morse, still slow, still hesitant. Argent ledger, dam accounts, midnight coach, tomorrow, switchback. The line went dead. Not just silent, but dead, as if the connection had been cut. Someone inside Pike's organization was leaking. Someone willing to risk their life. She needed Asher Voss. She found him in Dawnbreak Canyon, in a one-room shack built of scavenged lumber and regret. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and old wood smoke. His beautiful, precise maps were tacked to the walls, stained with spilled liquor. He was sitting on the floor, his back to the wall, a near-empty bottle in his hand. He looked up as her shadow fell across the floor. "Get out, Mara." "I am not here for a fight, Asher. I am here for a map." "I do not make maps anymore." "Pike is moving the dam ledger." She spoke quickly, the words sharp. "The real one. The one that shows the payments, the diversions, the bribes." He took a long pull from the bottle. "It is all blood money. It always was. It is moving tomorrow night. By coach, it is passing Switchback Bridge at midnight." Asher laughed. A dry, rattling sound. "So, you going to rob it, you, the telegraph girl? You'll be dead before you clear the canyon." "No," she said, her voice firm, pulling him from his haze. "We are going to steal it. You and I do not want your gun. Asher, I want your mind. I want the surveyor who mapped every inch of this territory. I want the man who designed the roads Pike uses." He looked at her, his gray eyes focusing for the first time. "I need a plan that does not involve bullets." Mara said, "The circuit judge is at Bitterbrush Station in 3 days. We get that ledger. We put it in his lap in open court. We expose Pike. We expose Wheeler. And we get the water back. No blood. Just the truth." The words "no blood" hung in the air. A redemption, not a revenge. He looked at his shaking hands, then at the maps on the wall. He had drawn the lines that had condemned the valley. Maybe he could draw the ones that saved it. He pushed the bottle away and slowly, painfully, pulled himself to his feet. "Rock fire cut," he said, his voice raw. "The road narrows. It is the only way south." They needed allies. They met in the dead of night, not in the saloon, but in the damp earthen root cellar of the Kestrel Ridge boarding house, beneath sacks of potatoes and barrels of salted fish. Mercy Doolin, the proprietor, was a woman in her 50s, with hands ruined by lye soap and eyes that missed nothing. Pike's water theft was killing her business. Boarders could not pay when their farms failed. He threatened Juniper Flats. Mara told her. Mercy's face hardened. "That man would burn a church if it cast a shadow on his mine. I am in. What do you need?" "Eyes on the Argent Crown stable," Mara said. "And a fast wagon, hidden, for when we are done." "For eyes, you need Finn," Mercy said immediately. "Finn Abernathy? He mucks the stalls at the livery, right next door to Pike's stable. He sees everything, and because he is a kid, nobody ever sees him." Finn was 13, small for his age, with a shock of red hair and the quiet, watchful presence of someone who has learned to survive by being invisible. His father had died in the same cave-in that had killed Rowdy Lee. He was an orphan of Pike's greed. He listened to Mara's request in the cellar, his expression unreadable. "I know the coach," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "A heavy-body Wells Fargo, painted black, 6 horses. But the signal you heard is wrong. It does not leave at midnight. Pike's stablemaster is hitching them for an 11 o'clock departure. He wants to be through the cut before the moon is high." Asher unrolled a map on a barrelhead. "He has changed the time. That is smart. But he will still use Rockfire Cut. It is a bottleneck. It is the perfect place for an ambush." "Which is why we will not attack him there," Mara said. Asher nodded, tapping the map. "We hit them here, 2 miles before the cut, the old switchback grade. The road is steep, and it runs right beside the abandoned railway tracks." The plan formed. A piece of intricate, dangerous machinery. Finn would watch the coach, confirming its departure and its guards. Mercy would have a light wagon waiting in a dry wash 5 miles from the site. Asher would handle the trap. "I have a coil of high-tensile surveyor's wire. Stretch tight, axle high. It will not break. It will catch the axle and stop the coach dead." "But they will be moving fast," Mara argued. "It will kill the horses, throw the driver." "Which is why you will stop them first," Asher said, pointing to the map. "There is a railway signal post here. From the old line. The wagon drivers still use it as a landmark. You, Miss Whitlock, are a telegrapher. You know signals. You will hang a yellow caution light. The driver will see it. Assume the grate is washed out, and slow to a walk before he hits my wire. It was a plan of timing, of signals, of engineering, not bullets. But Pike was not a fool, and his hounds were not lazy. Cassidy Rourke, his thin, watchful lieutenant, had seen Mara talking to Finn Abernathy near the livery. It was nothing. A woman giving a stable boy a coin. But Rourke did not believe in nothing. He felt the tension in the town since Mara's stand in the saloon. He went to Hale. The telegraph woman is planning something. She is too quiet. So we watch her. Hale grunted. No, we watch the money. Rourke said, hire the Sawtooth gang. Tell them $50 apiece to ride shadow on the coach tomorrow night. Tell them to stay hidden. Wait at Rockfire Cut. If anyone so much as looks at that coach, they are to open fire and leave no one standing. The next night, the fog was a physical presence. It crawled down from the high peaks, filling the canyons, smelling of cold stone and damp earth. It muffled sound, turning the world into a gray, claustrophobic bubble. Mara was in position, her dark canvas coat blending with the shadows of the signal post. She had hung her own lantern, its glass shielded with a panel of yellow cloth. Her heart beat a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. 50 yards down the dark, fog-bound road, Asher lay flat, adjusting the tension on the steel wire. He had anchored it to a granite boulder on one side and the steel railway track on the other. It was invisible in the gloom, a steel garrote waiting for the wagon. They heard it before they saw it, the jingle of harness, the thud-thud of heavy hooves, the low rumble of wheels. It was moving too fast, the driver pushing the horses hard to get through the pass. A dark shape materialized from the fog. The driver, perched high, saw the yellow light. "Whoa, whoa, damn it," he yelled, leaning back, hauling on the reins. "Grade fault easy." The coach horses, confused, broke their stride, slowing to a high-stepping, nervous walk. The heavy wagon groaned, its momentum slowing. It entered the trap. The wang of the wire was loud as a cannon shot in the fog. It snapped taut, catching the front axle perfectly. The wagon lurched to a violent, immediate halt. The lead horses screamed as they were thrown back. The driver was catapulted from his seat, landing with a heavy, wet thump in the gravel. From the back of the coach, a door burst open and 2 guards spilled out, rifles in hand. They were disoriented, shouting into the fog. What was it? Ambush! One of them, the cooler head, jammed his rifle into the air and fired. It was not a bullet. A white magnesium flare shot skyward, hissing, exploding above them. It lit the entire canyon in a stark, blinding white light, turning the fog into a wall of glaring silver. It was a signal. From 2 miles up the road, at Rockfire Cut, came the answer, a volley of rifle fire. The crack, 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 echoing down the canyon. The Sawtooth gang, alerted by the flare, was coming. "They had a backup," Asher yelled, pulling his Whitworth. "They will be here in minutes." The guards from the wagon were using the light, firing into the rocks where they had heard the wire snap. Mara was already moving, but she did not run to the wagon. She ran up the shallow embankment, back toward the railway tracks, pulling her own lamp. "Keep them busy," she shouted. She ripped the yellow panel from the lantern. Then she pulled the red wool scarf from her neck and wrapped it tightly around the glass. She ran along the ridge, parallel to the road, waving the deep red, magnified glow in a frantic, wide arc. Down the canyon, the Sawtooth gang, galloping hard, saw the light. It was not a lantern. In the heavy fog, it was a large, ominous, dancing red glow, moving along the ridge. It looked exactly like the leading edge of a brush fire, sweeping down the canyon wall. In a territory that was 90% tinder, fire was the only thing more terrifying than a gun. The lead rider pulled his horse to a skidding stop. "Fire! The canyon is on fire back! Get the horses out! Back out!" The gang, mercenaries who feared nothing but being burned alive and losing their mounts, did not hesitate. They wheeled their horses, cursing, and galloped back up the canyon, retreating to save their only escape. Mara's bluff had worked. Asher was at the wagon. The two guards, hearing the retreat of their own backup, panicked. They fired 2 more wild shots into the fog and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Asher holstered his pistol. He was not a thief, but he was a designer. The safe was bolted to the wagon bed, a new model from a firm in St. Louis. He had designed it. His fingers found the dial. He closed his eyes, the guilt and the irony thick as bile in his throat. He was breaking into his own creation. He did not listen for tumblers. He felt the alignment. Click, 22 degrees. The latitude of the main aquifer he had mapped. Click, 4 minutes. The precise diversion angle of the illegal dam. Click, 18 seconds. The day in June he had delivered the maps to Pike. The tumblers fell into place. The heavy steel door swung open with a well-oiled sigh. Inside, sitting alone, was one thick, leather-bound ledger. "We have it!" he yelled. Mara slid down the embankment, extinguishing her lamp. "Mercy's wagon! Go!" They ran, disappearing into the fog just as the driver began to groan, waking from his fall. As Mara scrambled up the far side of the road, her hand dug into her canvas coat pocket. Her fingers brushed the heavy, cold metal of the gold coin she had taken from the saloon. She pulled her hand out to grab a root, and the coin, slick with the sweat from her palm, slipped free. It spun once in the air and landed silently in the muddy rut left by the wagon wheel. They were gone. The ledger was theirs. But in the mud, half hidden, the $20 double eagle lay face up. The faint, rust-brown stain near the eagle's wing stared accusingly at the sky. The discovery of the gold coin in the mud by the recovering wagon driver was the spark. The man, his head split open and his temper burning, recognized Pike's signature mark. He looked at the disabled coach, the open safe, and the empty space where the ledger had been. He did not wait for the guards to return. He fired his own pistol 3 times into the air, the signal for a total disaster. Miles away, on the high pass overlooking Kestrel Ridge, a signalman saw the answering flash from the canyon. He lit the beacon. It was a stack of dry timber and oil-soaked rags, reserved for only 2 things: an Apache raid or an insurrection against the Argent Crown. A pillar of white fire tore a hole in the night, a silent, screaming alarm visible for 50 miles. It was a signal that the truce was over. Cassidy Rourke saw the beacon from Rockfire Cut, where his men had just finished cursing Mara's fake fire. His rage was a cold, sharp thing. He knew, instantly, they had been played. He knew who had the skill, and he knew where they would run. "Dawnbreak!" he roared, his voice cracking in the thin air. "It is the surveyor. They are running to Dawnbreak Canyon. $100 to the man who brings me Voss's scalp, and the woman." The pursuit was immediate and brutal. The Sawtooth Gang, humiliated and now enraged, joined Rourke and Hale's men. It was a pack of nearly 20 riders, a wave of vengeance thundering through the night, their torches making a streaming, angry red line against the darkness. Mara and Asher had already ditched Mercy's wagon. They were on the horses Mercy had left tied in a grove of cottonwoods, plunging deep into the winding, maze-like canyons that Asher called home. The ledger was in a leather satchel, heavy against Asher's side. "They are coming," Mara said, her voice tight. She did not need to look back. The sound of that many horses was a vibration in the ground itself, a tremor that spoke of annihilation. "They know this is my territory," Asher panted, urging his horse over a bed of loose shale. "Rourke will expect me to hide. We are not going to hide. We are going to block." He led her not deeper, but up, along a narrow goat path that opened onto a wider, secondary gorge. Spanning it was an old wooden trestle bridge, built for ore carts, not for a hunting party. "This is the only way across the gorge for 5 miles, Asher yelled, pulling his horse to a stop at the far end. "They follow us. They have to cross this." He dismounted, pulling his heavy Whitworth revolver. He did not aim at the riders, who were just now pouring into the mouth of the gorge below. A swarm of angry torches. He aimed at the bridge itself. He took a steady stance, his surveyor's eye calculating the load-bearing stress. He aimed for the main axle pin on the far side, where the heaviest support beam met the canyon wall. He fired. The boom of the heavy pistol echoed like a rock slide. The bullet, a massive piece of lead, shattered the iron housing. The wood groaned in protest. He fired again. The pin splintered. The support beam, its anchor gone, tore free. The bridge did not collapse in a clean explosion. It tore apart, a slow, agonizing scream of rending wood. The entire structure twisted, folding in on itself, and fell into the gorge, a cascade of timber and dust that sounded like the sky cracking open. It was the thunder the drought-stricken land had been waiting for. Rourke and his men pulled up hard at the edge of the new chasm, their horses rearing in panic. The bottleneck was complete. They were trapped on the wrong side, staring at a 50-foot drop. "You damn surveyor!" Rourke screamed, his voice thin with fury. He fired his rifle across the gap, the bullet whining past Asher's head. "That will not hold them." Asher grabbed Mara's arm. "There is a mule track 2 miles back. They will have to double back, but they will be on us in half an hour." They rode on, deeper into the dark, but Mara was pulling a heavy canvas sack from her saddlebag. One Mercy had packed. "They will be coming up the east trail," she said, "the one that narrows by the creek bed." "What is that?" Asher asked. "Coal dust," she said. "From the boarding house cellar. Mercy uses it for the water heaters." The east trail was a narrow path, worn deep into the rock, with a high wall on one side and a steep drop on the other. It was a perfect choke point. Mara tore the sack open and, as they rode, emptied its contents onto the path, a thick, black powder that settled in the dust. They reached the far end. Asher dismounted. He pulled a phosphorus match from his coat, the kind that would strike on any rough surface. "Wait for it," he whispered. They heard the horses, the jingle of harness, the curses of men forced into a single-file line. The first torch appeared, Rourke in the lead. Asher scraped the match against the granite wall. It flared to life. He tossed the small, sputtering flame onto the black powder. It did not burn. It detonated. A whoomph that was more sound than flame, a concussive blast of expanding air. A solid wall of thick, choking black smoke erupted, filling the narrow passage instantly. It was pure, pulverized carbon, a blinding, suffocating cloud. The horses screamed. The men, their vision gone, their lungs filled with acrid dust, choked and gagged. Torches were extinguished as if snuffed by a giant hand. The trail became a chaos of rearing. Panicked animals and blind, terrified men. "Now!" Asher yelled, grabbing Mara, and they plunged down the far side of the hill. They rode for their lives, the sounds of chaos and gunfire fading behind them. They did not stop until they reached Kestrel Wash, a dry riverbed shielded by weeping willows. Mercy Doolin was there, her face a pale oval in the pre-dawn light. She was not alone. She had 2 of the finest horses from the livery, fresh and ready. "They went by here 10 minutes ago," Mercy whispered, her voice fast. "A second group. Rourke must have split them. They were riding for the highway, trying to cut you off." "We go south, then," Asher said, sliding from his exhausted horse. He and Mara transferred the saddlebags. "Be careful," Mercy said, her eyes on Mara. "This is not just Rourke anymore. I saw the tracks. When that second group passed, they had a rider on a thoroughbred. A big man." Mara ran to the edge of the wash and looked at the tracks, clear in the damp sand. The horseshoes were standard, but one set, slightly apart from the others, was different. The print was clean, precise, and beside it, where the rider had clearly dismounted for a moment, was a boot print. It was not a worn-down cowboy heel. It was a custom-made, flat-soled boot with a distinctive crosshatch pattern on the sole. She had seen that boot print before, on the steps of the assay office, on the porch of the saloon. "Pike," she breathed. "He is out here himself." The hunt was no longer just for the ledger. It was personal. They rode south, avoiding the roads, cutting across the open range as the sky turned from black to a bruised, sickening purple. They rode until the horses were stumbling and the sun was a hot weight on their backs. Their destination was a small Darrell, lone juniper cabin abandoned, a relic of a failed homesteader. It was nestled in a small box canyon, invisible from the main trail. They half fell from the saddles, staggering into the one-room shack. Asher barred the door. Mara collapsed against the wall, the leather satchel with the ledger clutched to her chest. They were safe. For the moment, they were alive. They stood in the dusty silence, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The adrenaline that had kept them moving for 6 hours began to recede. Asher leaned heavily against the crude table. "We made it." "We made it," Mara repeated. Then she saw his hand. He was pressing it against his left side, just below the ribs. His fingers were dark and wet. "Asher," she said, her voice sharp. "You are hurt." He looked down, as if surprised. "It is nothing. A stray shot from the bridge. Just a graze." "Let me see." He grunted but pulled his hand away. The rough cotton of his shirt was soaked. It was not a graze. A bullet had torn a hot, shallow furrow along his side. A 4-inch gash that was bleeding steadily. The blood was dark against the blue fabric. "Sit," she commanded, pushing him onto the room's only chair. The cabin had been picked clean, but the homesteader had left a few desperate remnants. Mara found a small wooden box, a housewife kit for mending. Inside, there was no fine surgical silk, just a spool of thick, waxed linen thread, the kind used for repairing shoe leather, and a single, heavy-gauge needle. She found a tin of lamp oil and a reasonably clean rag. She poured the oil on the needle, then sterilized it in the flame of a match. Asher watched her, his face pale and beaded with sweat, but his eyes were clear. "This is going to hurt," she said. It was not an apology. It was a fact. "Get it done," he said, gripping the arms of the chair. She tore his shirt open. Her hands, which had trembled in the saloon, were now perfectly steady. She cleaned the wound, her touch efficient, impersonal. But as she prepared to make the first stitch, she paused. Her fingers rested on the bare skin next to the gash. It was hot, alive. The muscle beneath it was rigid with pain. Her hand did not tremble. She looked at him. Their eyes met. And in that moment, the cabin was not a dusty wreck, and they were not a telegrapher and a surveyor. They were just a man and a woman, bound by a shared, desperate act. She pushed the heavy needle through his skin. He inhaled sharply, his whole body tensing, a low groan forced from his chest. But he did not move. She pulled the thick thread through, tied the knot, and began the second stitch. Her movements were rhythmic, precise. Each stitch was a small anchor, pulling the edges of his life back together. Outside, the air had grown thick and heavy. A jagged line of light split the sky, a flash of dry lightning. It illuminated the cabin's single dusty window. Throwing their shadows into sharp relief, a woman bent over a man, her hands working. His body held rigid in trust and pain. A low rumble of thunder followed, the sound of an empty barrel rolling across the heavens. No rain came. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the rasp of Asher's breathing and the soft, steady pull of the linen thread as Mara stitched his wound closed. The silence between them was as heavy and as charged as the air outside. She tied off the last stitch, the thick linen thread dark with his blood. She snapped it with her teeth, her mouth filling with the taste of wax and iron. For a long moment, she did not move, her hands still resting on his side, her knuckles brushing the hot, damp skin of his stomach. The intimacy of the act hung in the small, dusty room, sharp as the smell of the lamp oil she had used to clean the needle. Asher's breathing was ragged, but the bleeding had stopped. He looked down at her hands, then up at her face. Her expression was unreadable. Her energy focused entirely on the mending of his flesh. He broke the silence, his voice a low rasp. "You have steady hands." "I have seen worse," she said, finally pulling away. She rose and walked to the cabin's single basin, pouring a small amount of water from their canteen to wash his blood from her fingers. Asher watched her back. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only the dull, throbbing ache in his side and a heavier, older pain in his chest. "Those maps," he said. Mara stopped, her hands in the gray water. "The ones I made," he continued, the words tasting like ash. "The ones that showed Pike where to find the water. They were not just for the mine. I knew what they were for." Mara turned very slowly. The water dripped from her fingertips. "He told me it was for a territorial survey," Asher said, his gaze fixed on the dirt floor. "A government contract, but I knew when I saw the lines he asked me to draw. He did not want to find water. He wanted to find all of it. He wanted to know which springs fed which creeks, which aquifers supplied which farms. He wanted a map of the valley's throat, so he would know exactly where to put the knife." He looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "The farms downstream, the Redwater Basin, Juniper Flats. I am the man who dried them out. I am the man who killed their cattle. I drew the map that did it." The confession landed with a dead, heavy sound. Mara's face, which had been soft with concentration, hardened. She took one step back, then another, putting the cabin's crude table between them. Her movement was not one of fear, but of revulsion. It was the same motion she had made at the saloon, pulling her hands away from Pike's stained coin. Her eyes, which he had just seen filled with a fierce, protective light, were now chips of ice. They were the eyes of a judge, of an executioner. They held the coldness of her father's death and the dryness of the valley's creek beds. "Whose side are you on, Asher?" The question was flat. It was not an accusation. It was a demand for a final, binding statement. Asher looked at the Whitworth revolver still holstered on his hip. He had used it to save them at the bridge. It was the only part of his old life, the surveyor's life of precision and violence, that he had kept. His hand went to the walnut grip. Mara tensed, her hand dropping to the small knife she kept at her belt. But Asher did not draw the weapon. He slowly, deliberately, unbuckled the heavy gun belt. He held it for a moment, the weight of the steel and leather a physical representation of his guilt. Then, he placed the entire rig on the floor. With the toe of his boot, he slid it across the dusty floorboards. It stopped near her feet, a silent, unconditional surrender, a confession in steel. "I am on the side of the water," he said, his voice raw. "I am on the side that puts it back." Mara watched the gun. She did not look at him. She looked at the weapon that had been a part of him, now offered up, discarded. She let the silence stretch, forcing him to live in the vacuum of his admission. "When they cut my father down," she said, her voice so low he had to lean forward. "The rope was new, from Pike's company store. It was wet from the rain, and it had stretched. It left a mark, a burn, deep in his neck." Asher closed his eyes. "I was 16. I had to wash him. The water was red. That night, after we buried him, I went to the saloon. I just stood outside. The men who had testified against him, Rourke and Hale, they were inside, drinking Pike's whiskey. They were laughing." She looked at Asher, her gaze a physical thing, sharp as a needle. "I stood out there in the mud, and I could hear them laughing, and all I could smell was the wet rope and the cold wood of the gallows. And the sky was clear. The storm had passed." She took a ragged breath. "That is what Pike does. He makes a storm, and then he drinks whiskey in the clear weather. while the rest of us are left to wash the dead and choke on the mud. Asher said the only thing he could. I'm sorry, Mara, for your father, for the water, for my part in it. Sorry does not put water in the creek, she said, the ice returning. It does not unhang a man. No, he agreed, his voice quiet. It does not, but actions can. He nodded toward the leather satchel she had dropped by the door. Is it in there? Is the proof as good as you hoped? The spell was broken. The past receded, and the urgent, dangerous present rushed back in. Mara retrieved the satchel and brought it to the table. The dry lightning flashed again, brighter this time, illuminating the room in a stark, blue-white glare. She untied the leather straps. Her hands were steady again. She pulled out the heavy, leather-bound book, Argent Crown Mining Company, Disbursements, Ledger, Private. She opened it. The pages were a sea of neat, precise copperplate script, columns of dates, names, and figures. It was exactly what she had hoped. It was a meticulous record of Pike's corruption. Here, she said, her finger tracing a line. June 10th, 1878, E. Wheeler, $100. The Redwater boundary dispute. Asher breathed, recognizing the date. He sold them the farms. August 2nd, E. Wheeler, $50. September 14th, E. Wheeler, $200. For travel and provisions. He was supposed to be in Kestrel Ridge that week, Mara whispered. That was when Rowdy's friends tried to file a grievance. Wheeler was out of town. She turned the page, and she found it. A separate column, tucked away near the binding, headed Special Expenses, D.P. Authorization. Her fingers stopped. Look. The entry was simple. October 5th, 1878. O.M. Disbursement, $20. Authorized E.W. Asher stared at it. O.M. Odette Maris, Mara said. The witness who vanished. The one they said took a health trip. $20, Asher said, the figure clicking into place. The price of a double eagle. The price of Pike's gold coin. Authorized E.W. Mara tapped the initials. Elias Wheeler. The judge. He did not just take the bribe. He paid the bribe. He used Pike's money to silence the witness to his own corruption. She looked up, her eyes blazing. The coin Pike offered me in the saloon. It was not just a bribe. It was a message. It was the same coin, the same method he used on Odette. He was telling me I would end up just like her. Gone. They had it. The direct link. The proof that would not only ruin Pike, but would dismantle the entire legal framework that protected him. They had the judge. Asher leaned back, the pain from his side momentarily forgotten, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. So, we go to Bitterbrush Station. We hand this to the U.S. Marshal who travels with the court. We expose Wheeler in his own courtroom. Yes, Mara said. She closed the ledger, but she did not look satisfied. She looked incomplete. We do that, but it is not enough. What do you mean, it is everything? It will put them in prison. It will put them in prison, Mara said, walking to the window. She looked out at the dry, blasted landscape, illuminated by another flash of lightning. But it does not bring the water back. Pike will be in a cell. Wheeler will be disbarred, and the Argent Crown will be in receivership, tied up in court by lawyers from San Francisco for 5 years. And that dam. She pointed north, toward the invisible high canyons. That dam will still be standing, and the basin will still be dust, and the children at Juniper Flats will still be thirsty. Justice for my father is one thing. Justice for the valley is another. Asher stood up, slowly, wincing as the stitches pulled. He came to stand beside her at the window. He understood what she was saying before she said it. You want to destroy it, he whispered. The dam. You are the man who drew the map. She said, you know where it is. You know how it was built. Can it be done? Ask looked at his hands, the hands that had drawn the lines. He thought of the dynamite they had left behind, the stolen property of the Argent Crown. He thought of the structural weaknesses he had noted in his own survey, the compromises Pike had made to build it fast and cheap. "Yes," he said, "it can be done." This was the moment. This was the true pact, sealed not with a handshake, but with a shared, illegal, and righteous purpose. It was not just about exposing the past, it was about reclaiming the future. The storm, which had been threatening all night, finally broke. A jagged, brilliant fork of lightning split the sky directly in front of them, striking the ridge on the far side of the small canyon. The crack was simultaneous, a deafening explosion that shook the small cabin to its foundations. In that single, brilliant, lingering moment of white-hot light, they were frozen, looking at each other. The masks were gone. He was not a drunken surveyor, and she was not a vengeful spinster. He saw the woman who had cried for her father, the one who had stitched his wound with a gentle, steady hand. She saw the man who had slid his gun across the floor, the man willing to tear down his own creation to atone for his sin. The light was so bright it burned away the shadows, and in their eyes, they saw the unspoken truth, the fear, the desperation, and the sudden, terrifying, and undeniable spark of something new, something that had not been there an hour ago. The thunder rolled away, and the cabin was plunged back into darkness, the silence heavier than before. Then they heard it, the first heavy drops of rain striking the cabin's dry tin roof like pennies. The first tentative drops on the roof became a drumming, then a roar. The drought, the terrible, suffocating dryness that had plagued the territory for 2 long years, finally broke. The sound on the tin roof was a deluge, a cleansing, a violent absolution. It was as if the sky had finally ripped open, washing away the dust and the blood and the tension. Inside the cabin, the sound was deafening, isolating them in a small, dark bubble of existence. The world outside, the world of Pike and Rourke and the hunt, was washed away. Asher shivered, a chill born of blood loss and the sudden, damp cold. "There is a stove," Mara said, her voice practical, pulling away from the window. "We need a fire." He found a few splintered pieces of dry pine and a half-full kindling box left by the long-gone homesteader. His hands fumbled with the match, the wound in his side pulling tight, but he managed to strike it. A small flame caught, licked at the pine, and then a cheerful, bright fire began to crackle in the rusty iron stove. A warm, yellow light filled the small room, pushing back the blue twilight of the storm. The scent of burning pine joined the smell of the rain and the damp earth. Asher sank back into the chair, the wave of warmth a dizzying relief. Mara stood by the fire, her hands outstretched to the heat, her silhouette dark against the flames. The rain hammered the roof, a relentless rhythm. She turned. In the flickering light, his face was pale, etched with pain and exhaustion. Her gaze dropped to his side, to the dark, crude stitches of shoe leather piercing his skin. "The ride may have strained them," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost shy, a sharp contrast to the command she had issued when she stitched him. "I should check the knots." It was an excuse. They both knew it. It was a reason to bridge the small, charged distance between them. He did not object, just nodded, his throat tight. She knelt beside his chair, as she had done before. But this was different. The danger was outside, held at bay by the storm. The cabin was a sanctuary. The fire was warm. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for just a second before touching the torn fabric of his shirt. She gently pulled it wider, exposing the wound to the firelight. Her stitches were ugly, but they were holding. The skin around them was bruised, but the bleeding had stopped. She had a small, cleaner piece of the rag she had used before. She dipped it in the canteen, and with a touch so light it was barely a sensation. She began to dab at the edges of the wound, cleaning away the last of the dried blood. Her movements were slow, respectful, as if tending to something fragile. He watched her. He watched the firelight catch the stray strands of her hair, turning them from brown to bronze. He watched the intensity in her expression, the same focus she had given the ledger, now applied to his skin. He could smell the clean scent of the rain on her clothes, mixed with the faint, metallic tang of his own blood. She finished, but she did not pull away. Her hand lingered, resting on the uninjured skin of his stomach, her palm flat, absorbing the heat of his body. He was breathing in, his ribs rising against her hand. She was breathing out. Their rhythms were almost synchronized. He was sitting. She was kneeling. Their faces were only inches apart. The sound of the rain was a dull roar, the fire a soft crackle. He could see the exhaustion at the corners of her mouth. And something else, a vulnerability she had kept hidden behind the telegraph key and the ledger. He raised his uninjured hand, his right hand. He saw it tremble, not from weakness, but from the weight of the moment. He touched her cheek. His fingers were calloused, rough from surveyor's tools and gunmetal, but his touch was hesitant, gentle. He brushed at a smudge of soot left over from the coal dust explosion. She did not flinch. She did not pull back. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, leaning into his touch as if it were an anchor. His voice was a low rasp, barely audible over the storm. "Mara, are you sure?" She opened her eyes. The question was not about the wound. It was not about the plan. It was about this, about the border they were about to cross, one from which there was no return. Mara did not answer with words. She gave a single, slow nod. It was permission. It was a mutual agreement. She lifted her own hand, placing it against his jaw, her cool fingers tracing the line of his stubble. Her touch was a question and a statement. He leaned down. She rose up. The first kiss was not a crash of passion. It was a slow, deliberate discovery, a collision of two solitudes. It was hesitant, tasting of wood smoke, rain, and the faint, bitter salt of exhaustion. It was a question. Then, finding no resistance, it deepened. It became an answer. It was not the desperate, frantic grasp of two people lost in the dark. It was a long, slow, unfolding recognition. It was the confession in the cabin, the shared guilt over the maps, the pact to destroy the dam. It was the echo of the gunshot, the thunder of the bridge collapsing, the shared terror and the shared victory. It was all of it, concentrated into a single, profound point of contact. His hand slid from her cheek to the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her thick, unbound hair, pulling her gently, firmly, closer. Her hand on his jaw slid up, her fingers threading into the hair at his temple, holding him as he held her. Her other hand, the one that had been cleaning his wound, flattened against his chest, her palm absorbing the heavy, rapid thump of his heart. She felt a tremor run through him, or perhaps it was her own. They broke for air, but did not move apart. She rested her forehead against his, their eyes closed. They were breathing the same air, their breath warm and shared. "I thought," she whispered, her voice thick, "I thought the ledger was all I had, the debt, the anger. I thought that was all I was." "It is not," he whispered back, his lips brushing her temple. "You are the woman who brought the rain." He kissed her again, and this time there was a new urgency, a need to erase the cold, the fear, the years of loss. He stood, pulling her up with him, a sharp grunt of pain escaping him as the stitches on his side pulled tight. "Asa," she started, pulling back. "Your side—" "It can wait," he said, his voice raw. He looked at the narrow, miserable cot in the corner, and then at the warm, glowing fire. On the cot was a single, thick wool blanket, dusty but dry, his eyes never leaving hers. He reached over, grabbed the blanket, and with a single, sharp gesture, spread it on the wooden floor in front of the stove. It was an invitation, a bed made of desperation and shared warmth. They sank down onto the blanket. A deliberate, mutual lowering. She helped him ease himself down, mindful of his wound. They lay on their sides, facing each other, the small fire painting their faces in orange and red. Outside, the rain was a relentless, washing sound, cleansing the dust from the entire territory. Inside, they began a slow, healing exploration. His hand traced the line of her throat, his thumb brushing the pulse that beat there. She laid her hand flat on his bare chest, feeling the solid, living muscle, the steady beat of his heart. He pulled her closer, his good arm wrapping around her waist, drawing her against him until there was no space left between them. She was still in her shirt and trousers. He was half-dressed from his wound. This was not about shedding clothes. It was about shedding the armor they had both worn for so long. The firelight caught the high curve of her shoulder as she arched closer to him, the line of her back, the tangle of their legs. It was a language of trust, of unspoken need. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, the smell of rain and smoke and something that was just her. She held on to him, her fingers gripping his shoulder, anchoring herself against the man who had, in the span of one night, become her partner, her confessor. And now, this. The fire in the stove began to die, the bright flames sinking to glowing, red coals. The cabin grew darker, warmer. The roar of the rain on the roof gentled, softening to a steady, lulling drumbeat. They did not speak. There were no vows, no promises of forever. The world outside was still waiting to kill them. Pike was still hunting them. The dam was still standing. But in the small, dark cabin, wrapped in a single wool blanket, they held each other. It was a promise not of a lifetime, but of the morning. It was an unspoken oath to face the dawn, and whatever came after it, together. The dawn broke cold and sharp, the rain-washed air so clean it felt sterile. In the small, dusty cabin, the fire was gray ash, the blanket on the floor, a tangle of wool, was the only evidence of the night. A small island of warmth in a world that had gone back to being hard and cold. Asher woke first, the pain in his side a hot, sharp reminder. He sat up, his movement stiff. Mara was already at the window, dressed, her hair tightly bound, her hand resting on the leather satchel that held the ledger. She was the telegrapher again, her face a mask of cold resolve. The intimacy of the dark was gone, erased by the practical, dangerous light of day. "They will be looking," she said, not turning. "The storm will have washed out our tracks, but not for long." "Pike will check the cabin," Asher said, pulling on his boots. "He knows I used to hide here." He stood, testing his weight. The stitches pulled, but they held. "We have to get to Bitterbrush Station. It is a 60-mile ride, and we have to assume they are guarding every road south." They rode out, not as lovers, but as soldiers, their horses picking their way carefully down the slick rock of the canyon. They stayed low, following the wash, the willows providing meager cover. They were 10 miles from Kestrel Ridge when they saw the rider. It was Finn Abernathy, riding a livery mule bareback, his face pale with panic. He was scanning the ridges, and when he saw them, he waved frantically, sliding off the mule and running toward them. "Miss Whitlock, Mr. Voss, you cannot go into town, you cannot go anywhere." He was out of breath, his chest heaving. He shoved a crumpled piece of paper into Mara's hand. It was a flyer, the ink still damp, the paper cheap. "Wanted for felony robbery of railroad property and conspiracy. Mara Whitlock, Asher Voss." Below the words was a crude woodcut of Mara's face. "Reward, $500, dead or alive. Authorized by the Argent Crown Mining Company, in protection of territorial commerce." "Pikes put them up everywhere." Finn gasped. All over town. He telegraphed the news to every station down the line. He says you robbed the payroll coach, that it was railway property, that you are anarchists. Mara crushed the paper in her fist. He is painting us as criminals, federal criminals. It is worse than that, ma'am, Finn said, his eyes wide. The reward, $500. It is more money than this town's seen in a year. Strangers are riding in, bounty hunters, men I have never seen. They are checking every wagon, searching every stable, the whole town. It is split. Some folks are whispering, saying you did right, but most just want the money. Asher looked south, toward Bitterbrush Station. He has wired ahead. The road will be blocked. We will be shot on sight, long before we get near the courthouse. The courthouse, Finn said, a new wave of panic on his face. That is the other thing. Judge Wheeler. He did not stay at the junction. He rode in this morning, with the storm. He is at the hotel right now. He says, given the unrest, he is convening the court tonight, in Kestrel Ridge. What? Mara's head snapped toward him. Tonight, not Bitterbrush. In the old grain warehouse, at 6 o'clock. The trap had just sprung. The 60-mile ride for justice had become a 10-mile ride into a box. Pike was not just hunting them. He was consolidating his power, bringing his paid-for judge into the center of his own territory, surrounded by his own men and a town full of new bounty hunters. He is controlling the entire board, Asher said, his voice grim. We cannot get within 100 yards of that warehouse. It is worse, Finn whispered, and now his voice broke, tears finally welling. It is Mercy. Mara slid from her horse. What about Mercy? Finn, what happened? Rourke, he and Hale. They came to the boarding house at dawn. They said she was harboring fugitives. They dragged her out. Where is she? Mara's voice was a low, dangerous command. We do not know, but... Finn pulled something from his pocket. It was a woman's straw bonnet, simple and plain, but Mara recognized the faded blue ribbon. It was Mercy's. The straw was broken, crushed, and dark, with the mud of the KRL cemetery. I found this, snagged on the cemetery gate. Rourke. He left it there. I saw him. He dropped it and looked right at me. It is a message. Miss Mara. He is daring you. The vice closed. It was a perfect, brutal maneuver. Pike had the law, the money, and the town. Rourke had the one person they could not afford to lose. The ledger, Mara said, her voice hollow. He wants the ledger. He will trade her for it. She looked at Asher, her eyes filled with a cold, terrifying certainty. I am going in. I am giving him the book. No. Asher's voice was granite. He grabbed her arm as she turned to her horse. Now let go of me, Asher. This is not a debate. He took her because of me. I will not let that woman die for my debt. And he knows that, Asher said, his grip tightening. He did not hold her like a lover. He held her like a soldier stopping a comrade from running onto a mine. It is the trap. Mara, you walk in there with that book. He will kill you. He will kill Mercy. And he will burn the ledger. And it will all be for nothing. The valley stays dry. Pike wins. I will not, she choked, the words tearing at her. Let her die. She will not. He pulled her around, forcing her to look at him. The drunken, self-pitying surveyor was gone. This was the man who had mapped terrain under fire, the man who saw angles and exits where others saw only walls. We do not choose. We do both. We save Mercy, and we get that ledger into the courthouse. It is a two-pronged attack. It is the only way. How? She demanded. Pike has 20 men. We are 2 people, and the whole town is hunting us. We have Finn, Asher said, looking at the boy. And we have the truth. And they are overconfident. He began to speak quickly, his mind seeing the map, the angles. Where are they holding her? The Argent Crown Warehouse, Number 3, by the rail spur. Finn said instantly. It is where they keep the spare equipment. Rourke and Hale are there, with maybe 10 of the Sawtooth gang. Good. They will be watching the front. They will be watching for you. Mara. They will not be watching for the Undertaker. The Undertaker, Mara said. Finn, Asher commanded. Go to Mr. Abernathy, the Undertaker. Tell him you have a miner's accident to pick up. A charity case from Juniper Flats. Tell him you need the hearse and a pine box. The hearse, Finn's eyes widened. It is the only wagon in Kestrel Ridge that no bounty hunter will dare to stop and search, Asher said. I need one more thing. From your office. Mara, from the supply cache. Dynamite. I cannot. Yes, you can. You know the emergency order code. Tell the operator you have a line fault. Tap it out yourself. Have a runner leave 3 sticks by the back door of the telegraph office. Finn can pick them up. The plan was audacious. It was insane. It was perfect. While Finn ran, they cut to the warehouse. The air was thick with the smell of axle grease and cold iron. Mercy Doolin was tied to a heavy oak chair, her wrists bound tight with hemp rope. Rourke sat on a crate opposite her, cleaning his pistol, a dry, rattling cough shaking his thin frame. She will come, Rourke said to Hale, who was blocking the door. Pike offered 500. She knows we have you. She cannot resist. Too much righteousness. You are a fool, Cassidy. Mercy's voice was clear, ringing in the warehouse. You are just Pike's spade. You dig the hole, and then he fills it. He will not share the valley with a man like you. Hale took a heavy step toward her, his hand raised. Go ahead, Mercy said, not flinching. It will not make her get here any faster, and it will not make your death any slower. Hale growled, but stopped. Rourke laughed. A dry hack. Tough old bird. Does not matter. By sundown, it is all over. He turned back to his pistol. Neither man was watching Mercy's hands, which were bound behind the chair. They had searched her for a knife, for a derringer. They had not checked her hair. Slowly, painfully, her fingers cramped and raw. She worked. She had managed to free the long, sharp, jet-black hairpin from her bun. It was now in her right hand. She was not picking a lock. She was picking the knot. The hemp was stiff, the knot was deep, but her fingers, strong from a lifetime of wringing lye and kneading dough, were patient. She felt one of the loops begin to give. By the time the sun began to sink, turning the sky a bruised, sickly yellow, they were regrouped in the alley behind the undertaker's shop. The black glass-paneled hearse stood waiting. Inside, in the back, sat a simple pine coffin. Tucked inside the coffin were 3 sticks of dynamite, a coil of fuse, and a blasting cap. All right, Asher said, his voice low and fast. He looked at Mara. This is where we split. I go for Mercy, Mara said. I am the bait. No, Asher said. He is right. They are waiting for you. You are the only one who can walk into that courthouse. You are the face on the poster. You are the one who has to face Wheeler. You are the only one who can tell the story. He slung the leather satchel, holding the ledger over her shoulder. Asher, I cannot... You must. This is your fight, Mara. It always has been. What about Mercy and the dam? That is my fight, he said, his hand touching the wound in his side. I brought Finn. He will drive the hearse to the back of the warehouse. I will be on the roof. The explosives are the diversion. I am not going to set them on the door. I am going to set them on the dam. I am going to get Mercy, and then I am going to tear down my own creation. You expose the crime, I will erase the sin. It was a terrible, beautiful symmetry. He would rescue the woman Pike had taken, and he would destroy the dam he had built. She would face the judge who had failed her, and present the evidence that would save the town. He gripped her shoulder. Go, get to the warehouse. Wait for the dust to kick up. What dust? Asher checked his pocket watch. The light in the alley was a deep, ominous yellow. The wind was picking up. a low, moaning howl that was growing in pitch. "It is 5:12, he said. He pointed to the sky. "The rain is gone, the land is dry, and the wind is coming from the south. A dervish. It will hit the town in minutes." He turned to Finn. "You ready, son?" Finn, his face pale but his jaw set, nodded. "Yes, sir." Asher and Finn climbed onto the driver's seat of the hearse. Asher took the reins. He looked at Mara one last time. "Be safe," he said. "Do not die," she replied. Just as he snapped the reins, the world dissolved. The low moan became a high-pitched, deafening scream. A wall of solid red, a churning cloud of topsoil and alkali dust, swept up the street, engulfing the town. Visibility dropped from a mile to an arm's length in a single second. The sun was gone, blocked by a ceiling of grit. "Now!" Asher's voice was a yell, barely audible over the roar of the wind. "A God-given fog! Use it! Mara ride!" He cracked the whip, and the hearse plunged into the swirling red darkness, heading for the warehouse. Mara pulled her scarf over her nose and mouth, kicked her horse, and rode straight into the heart of the storm, toward the courthouse. The Kestrel Ridge grain warehouse was a cathedral of dust. The air was thick with the smell of chaff, old burlap, and the nervous sweat of 100 packed-in men. Kerosene lamps hung from the high rafters, swayed in the wind that found its way through every crack. The dust storm outside was not just a sound, it was a physical pressure, a high, screaming whine that made the entire building groan. The air inside was red, hazy with the grit that forced its way under the doors and through the window frames. At the far end, on a platform built of stacked flour sacks, sat Judge Elias Wheeler. He was a large man, his face puffy and pink, his judicial robes already stained with tobacco juice. He hammered a gavel against a crate. "This court is convened," he bellowed, his voice thin against the howl of the wind. "In the matter of the territorial disturbance, bring the prisoners." The room was not a courtroom. It was an arena. Dorian Pike sat in the front row, flanked by his lawyer, Caldwell, a thin man in a city suit. The walls were lined with men from the Sawtooth Gang and a dozen new, hard-eyed bounty hunters, all drawn by the promise of $500. The jury, 12 men selected by Maddox Hale an hour earlier, looked at their boots, avoiding everyone's eyes. The main doors crashed open. The wind exploded into the room, extinguishing 3 of the lamps and sending a cloud of red dust swirling down the aisle. It was Mara. She stood in the doorway, a phantom against the red, howling chaos of the outside world. She was coated in grit, her hair a wild tangle, the leather satchel clutched in her hand. For a second, the room was utterly silent, the wind's shriek the only sound. "Seize her!" Wheeler roared, pointing a trembling finger. "That is the fugitive! Seize the woman!" The bounty hunters surged forward, hands on their guns. "I am here to testify." Mara's voice cut through the noise, clear and sharp as the crack of a whip. She strode down the aisle, the men parting before her as if she were carrying a disease. "I am here as a witness to the robbery of the Redwater Basin, to the murder of Eben Whitlock, and to the corruption of this court." Pike stood up, a slow, amused smile on his face. He held up a hand. "Your Honor, please, let the woman speak." Caldwell, his lawyer, looked at him in shock. "Mr. Pike, she is admitting to—" "Silence, Caldwell," Pike said, his eyes fixed on Mara. He wanted this. He wanted the confrontation. He wanted the ledger, and he wanted to destroy her in front of the entire town. "Let us hear this testimony. Let us see the proof she has manufactured." Mara reached the front. She ignored Pike. She ignored the guns. She walked directly to the crate serving as the witness stand and, with a heavy, final thud, dropped the leather satchel onto it. "This court," Wheeler sneered, "recognizes no such witness." Mara untied the straps. She pulled out the heavy, leather-bound ledger. Then perhaps the court recognizes its own banker. She opened the book. Pike's smile did not waver, but his eyes narrowed. I present the private disbursement ledger of the Argent Crown Mining Company, Mara announced. The jury looked up. Every man suddenly focused. It details, among other things, payments made to this court. Wheeler went pale. This is libel. This is slander that is a forged document. Is it? Mara's finger traced a line. June 10th, 1878, to E. Wheeler. $100, the same day the Redwater boundary dispute was settled, granting all water rights to the Argent Crown. A low, angry murmur rolled through the crowd. September 14th. Mara continued, her voice rising. E. Wheeler, $200 for travel expenses. The same week the safety grievance for Shaft 4, filed by Rowdy Lee, was dismissed because the judge was out of town. This is an outrage, Caldwell screamed. Finding his voice, he leaped to his feet. Objection, that book, if it is even real, was acquired through armed robbery and, I am told, the destruction of railroad property. It is stolen evidence. It is inadmissible. It is the truth, Mara said. It is fruit of a poisoned tree, Caldwell shrieked, his face red. It cannot be entered. You have no proof. You have nothing but a stolen book. Mara held his gaze. I have one more thing. She reached deep into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the cold, heavy coin. She pulled it out and, with a sharp, ringing click, tossed it onto the open ledger. It spun, the firelight catching the glint of gold and the dark, rust-brown stain. Judge Wheeler stopped breathing. He stared at the coin as if it were a snake. The sweat on his face was no longer from the heat. It was a slick, cold sheen of pure terror. The special expense account, Mara said, her voice dropping, cold and precise. October 5th, 1878, $20. Authorized E.W. The payment made to Odette Maris to silence her testimony about this court's dealings with Mr. Pike. The room was so quiet. The howl of the wind seemed to be inside, pressing on their ears. You have no witness, Wheeler finally gasped, his voice a wet croak. You cannot prove that. Where is this Odette Maris? Where is she? Pike was on his feet now, his face no longer amused. Yes, Miss Whitlock. Where is your witness? You bring these accusations. Where is your proof? Before Mara could answer, the floor beneath them trembled. It was not the wind. It was a low, deep, concussive crump that came from the earth itself, a tremor that shook the dust from the rafters. The lamp swung wildly. A sack of grain toppled from the dais. What in God's name was that? Wheeler yelled, grabbing the side of his crate. Then came a new sound. Beneath the shriek of the storm, there was a distant, heavy roar. It was a sound no one in Kestrel Ridge had heard in 2 years. The main doors burst open again. It was not Mara. It was a farmer, his clothes in rags, his eyes wide with a manic joy. Water, he screamed, his voice breaking. Water the river is back, the gallows bend is full. The word hit the room like a physical blow. The bounty hunters, the jurors, the townsfolk, they forgot the trial, they forgot Pike, they forgot everything. They surged as one body, a human wave, pouring out of the warehouse doors and into the red storm. They stopped, staring into the gloom. Through the swirling red dust, they could see it. A churning, muddy, glorious torrent of water was thundering down the dry, cracked bed of the gallows bend, reclaiming its territory, filling the air with the smell of life and wet earth. A cheer went up. A ragged, disbelieving, primal yell of joy. The farmers were on their knees, weeping, scooping the muddy water into their hands. The dam was gone. Inside the warehouse, the truth had finally landed. The jury was on its feet, looking at Judge Wheeler, their expressions no longer cowed, but filled with a cold, pure fury. Wheeler was ruined. Dorian Pike understood. The ledger was real. The dam was gone. His entire empire, built on stolen water, had just washed away. He did not wait for the verdict. He did not wait for the marshal. He pulled the heavy Colt revolver from beneath his coat. The crowd screamed, scrambling back. He aimed it directly at Mara. "You!" he snarled, his voice a low growl of pure hatred. "This was all you." Pike, the side door of the warehouse, the one leading to the rail spur, smashed open. It was Mercy Doolin. Her hair was a wild gray halo. Her dress was torn, her hands raw and bloody from undoing Rourke's knots. In her hand, she held a lit kerosene lantern. "For Eben Whitlock, you bastard!" she screamed. With all her strength, she hurled the lantern. It tumbled end over end, shattering on the floor at Pike's feet. A whoosh of flame. The dry, chaff-covered floor, soaked in kerosene, ignited instantly. A wall of fire erupted, separating Pike from the rest of the room. The crowd panicked, a stampede of terror. Pike was trapped, a ring of fire licking at his boots. He raised his pistol and fired into the ceiling. "Rourke Hale, get me out of here." Crack! A single rifle shot echoed from the high rafters. It was not at Pike. High above, balanced on a catwalk, was Asher Voss. He was soaking wet, covered in mud from the dam, his rifle at his shoulder. He had not aimed at a man. He had aimed at the thick hemp rope holding the warehouse fire bell. The rope snapped. The entire mechanism, a massive iron bell and the 50-gallon water tank above it, tore free from the rotten beam. It crashed down, landing in the center of the flames with the sound of a collapsing building. The tank burst. 100 gallons of stagnant, algae-filled water exploded outward, dousing the fire in a cloud of hissing steam, smoke, and ash. In the sudden, dripping silence, Mara stood where she was, at the witness stand. She was soaking wet, the ledger clutched to her chest. She looked up at Asher, a black silhouette in the rafters. He looked down at her. She turned her gaze to Dorian Pike, who was sputtering, covered in ash and foul water. "The truth," Mara's voice rang out in the stunned, quiet room, "does not burn." That broke the spell. The U.S. Marshal, who had come with Wheeler but was not on his payroll, drew his weapon. "Dorian Pike, you are under arrest for conspiracy, theft, and attempted murder." 2 local deputies, seeing which way the wind was blowing, grabbed Judge Wheeler, who was babbling, trying to wipe the soot from his face. It was a mistake. The ledger is forged." They twisted his arms behind his back and snapped the cuffs on. Caldwell, the lawyer, was already gone. He had vanished in the stampede. Pike's men, Rourke and Hale, converged on their boss. They drew their pistols. "Cover him!" Rourke shrieked. They created a wall of lead, firing not at the crowd, but into the ceiling, into the remaining grain sacks, showering the room in dust and powder. It was a retreat. Asher tried to get a clear shot from the rafters, but the smoke and steam were too thick. Using the chaos, Pike, flanked by his 2 lieutenants, smashed through a back-loading door and disappeared into the red chaos of the dust storm. The trial was over. The warehouse was a smoking, flooded wreck. Wheeler was in chains. But Pike was gone. Asher dropped from the rafters, landing in a crouch amid the smoking, sodden ruin of the warehouse floor. The U.S. Marshal was barking orders, cuffing Judge Wheeler, who was weeping openly. His dignity washed away with the soot. Mercy Doolin was already at the side door, holding a rag to a gash on her arm. "They are gone," she said, her voice grim, as Mara and Asher ran to her. "Pike, Rourke, and Hale. Out the back. They killed the railmaster at the spur and took an ore cart." "Where?" Asher demanded. "Where else?" Mercy spat, pointing into the swirling red dust. "He is running to the high mines, back toward Dawnbreak Canyon. He knows those tracks. He will be gone in an hour." He will not. Mara said. She still had the ledger, now soaked and warped, clutched in her hand. She turned to Asher. Our horses. This way, he said, grabbing her arm. Finn, his face a pale mask of awe and terror, had brought their mounts into the alley, keeping them calm against the storm. Marshal, Asher yelled back into the warehouse. Pike is on the mine railway, headed for dawnbreak. We are going after him. The marshal, a tall, grim man, looked at the wanted poster in his hand, then at Mara. I will get a posse, but in this storm. We will not wait, Mara said, swinging into her saddle. They plunged into the red gale. The dust was so thick it was like riding through a physical object, a cloud of pulverized rock that stung their skin and blinded their eyes. The wind howled, a deafening, maddening shriek that erased all other sound. They rode by instinct, following the raised bed of the Kestrel Spur Railway, a treacherous line that clung to the side of the canyons. Asher led, his head down, navigating a path he knew by heart. The storm that had been their cover was now their enemy, trying to tear them from their saddles. They were not just chasing Pike, they were chasing a ghost in a hurricane. After 20 minutes of brutal riding, Asher pulled up. The track fork's here, he yelled over the wind. He will follow the main line. We can cut across the ridge. It is dangerous, but it is faster. What is dangerous? Mara shouted back. The mud, he replied. The rain we had, it sits in hollows up here. Quicksand, poisoned with alkali from the mine runoff. A horse goes in. It does not come out. How do we know where to ride? I marked it, he said, urging his horse forward. A long time ago, I marked the safe paths. He led her onto a barely visible trail. The wind was a solid wall, but through the red haze, Mara saw it, a small, faint flame, guttering in the lee of a boulder. It was not red or yellow. It was a pale, chemical green. Asher had planted sulfur torches, survey markers, months or even years ago, to map the safe passage across his own desolate, private land. He was guiding them through a minefield he himself had charted. They passed another, a small green fire burning like a lost soul in the red hell of the storm, and they knew they were on the right path. They rode hard for another 10 minutes, the green flames their only guide, and then they broke through. The trail rejoined the main spur, and they saw it. Half a mile ahead, the ore cart was laboring up a steep grade. It was a simple, flat iron bed with a long handbrake lever, moving faster than any horse could on this terrain. They could see 3 figures, Rourke and Hale pumping the handcar mechanism, Pike standing at the front, looking back, a rifle in his hand. The chase was on. The horses, fresh and running on solid ground, began to close the gap. Crack! A bullet whined past Mara's ear. Pike was firing at them, the wind snatching the sound away, leaving only the lethal zip of the lead. Get closer, Asher yelled, pulling his own revolver. He was firing with one hand, his wounded side a blaze of agony, his shots going wild. They were on a long, straight stretch of track, running parallel to the horse path, separated by a narrow, 5-foot gap. On the other side was a sheer 1,000-foot drop into the red chasm of the canyon. He is going to beat us to the tunnel, Asher roared. We lose him in there. Mara looked at the cart, then at the narrowing gap. She was a better rider. She kicked her horse, pulling ahead of Asher, her eyes fixed on the flatbed. The horse, sensing her urgency, gave a powerful surge, its hooves digging into the gravel. She was level with the back of the cart. Hale, a massive, slow man, turned to block her, raising his own pistol. Mara, no! Asher screamed. She did not hesitate. Standing in her stirrups, she gathered herself, and as her horse drew even, she leaped. She left the saddle, flying across the 5-foot void, landing hard on the iron bed of the cart. She rolled, the impact knocking the breath from her. Hale lunged, grabbing for her. his face a mask of rage. But the cart was moving, and Mara had momentum. She came up under his arm, the small skinning knife from her belt in her hand. She did not stab him. She jammed the hilt of it into his throat. A blunt, brutal blow. Hale gagged, clutching his neck, and stumbled backward. He tripped over the handcar pump and, with a short, surprised grunt, toppled over the side, vanishing into the red chasm. Rourke screamed, abandoning the pump, and drew his pistol. Before he could fire, Asher's revolver barked. Rourke's chest exploded in a puff of dust and blood. He stared down at the hole, then at Asher, an expression of pure disbelief on his face, before collapsing onto the iron deck. It was just Pike. He dropped the rifle and drew his Colt, but Mara was already on him. She slammed into his chest, her hands grabbing his gun wrist. They went down in a tangle of limbs, wrestling for the weapon. Pike was a brute, his weight overwhelming. He roared, slamming her head against the iron. "You!" he spat, his face inches from hers. "You ruined me. I built this town." "You poisoned it!" she screamed back, her fingers slipping on the gun. He used his weight, forcing the muzzle of the gun toward her face. "Everyone has a price. You stupid girl, you should have taken the gold." "Some people," Mara gasped, her knee coming up, striking him hard in the gut, "just deserve to be paid back." The blow made him grunt. His grip loosened for a half-second. The heavy Colt clattered to the deck. In the same instant, the gold coin, the stained double eagle that had been in her coat pocket, was jolted loose. It fell from her pocket, bounced once, and rolled across the iron deck, spinning in a perfect, glittering circle before coming to rest near the edge of the chasm. Pike saw it. His entire focus, his entire being, shifted. The fight, Mara, the gun, all of it vanished. He saw his philosophy, his power, his very soul, about to roll away into nothing. "Mine!" he bellowed. He lunged for it, a desperate, greedy grab, abandoning his attack on Mara. In that exact second, Asher, riding alongside, his horse screaming with effort, saw his chance. He could not jump. He could not get a clear shot. He grabbed a loose iron track spike from the side of the railbed. With a surge of desperate strength, he leaned low from his saddle and jammed the spike into the cart's wheel mechanism. The screech of metal on metal was a sound from hell. Sparks exploded in a white-hot shower. The cart, moving at full speed, bucked like a wounded animal, lurching to a violent, shuddering halt. Mara was thrown against the side. Pike, his body overextended, his fingers just inches from the coin, was thrown forward. He did not stumble. He was launched. He sailed over the edge of the cart and into the void. But as he fell, Mara, her reflexes pure instinct, shot her hand out and grabbed his wrist. Silence. The wind howled. The cart was still, wedged tight by the spike. Asher's horse reared, panting. Dorian Pike hung suspended, his entire bulk held by Mara's single, slim hand. Below him was 1,000 feet of empty, red air. He was a dead weight, his face purple, his eyes bulging in pure, primal terror. Mara held him. Her arm was on fire, the muscles screaming, her shoulder socket threatening to tear. She looked down into his face. She saw the man who had ordered her father's death. She saw the man who had laughed. She saw the man who had stolen the water and starved the valley. She had him. The debt was here, in her hand. She could open her fingers. She could let go. It would be an execution. It would be justice. He looked up, his arrogance gone, replaced by the terrified, pleading expression of a child. "Please," he whispered, the wind tearing the word from his lips. "God, please!" Mara looked at his face. She looked at her hand, holding his. She saw the mud on her knuckles, the blood under her nails. She thought of her father and the cold, wet rope. She pulled, with a groan that was torn from the very bottom of her soul. She hauled against his weight, Her boot slipped on Rourke's blood. "Asher!" she screamed. Asher was off his horse, hobbling to the cart. He grabbed Pike's other arm. Together, they heaved. They dragged him, choking and sobbing, back onto the iron bed. He collapsed, a quivering mass of ruined broadcloth, blubbering like an infant. Mara stood over him, her chest heaving, her arm a column of pure agony. She had saved him. She had denied him the easy death of a fall. "Your crimes," she panted, her voice shaking, "have to be paid to the living." As if summoned by her words, they heard the pounding of hooves. The youths, Marshall, followed by a dozen townsfolk, now a fully fledged posse, thundered up the track. They reined in, their faces grim, their rifles leveled. They saw Pike, unarmed and weeping. They saw Rourke, dead. They saw Mara and Asher, alive, bloody and standing. The marshal holstered his pistol and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Far below, in the valley, a new sound had joined the wind. The spillway of the dam, its main gate shattered, was now releasing a steady, controlled, life-giving stream into the gallows bend. The roar of the flood had subsided, replaced by the healthy, constant music of a living river. From the direction of the farms, faint on the wind, they could hear the shouts of men and the high, clear sound of children laughing as they ran, for the first time in years, in the cool, cleansing water. Mara walked to the edge of the cart and looked down at the gold coin, still resting near the edge. She nudged it with her boot. It tipped and fell, spinning, into the chasm, where it vanished into the deep red shadows. She turned away. She still had the ledger. She opened its soaked and warped cover to the last page, the one headed Dorian Pike. She pulled a pencil from her pocket, the lead wet but dark. She wrote Dorian Pike, brought to justice, and underneath it the water returned. She closed the book. The debt was paid. The retribution was not swift as a bullet, but slow and grinding as the law. Dorian Pike, brought back in chains, his arrogance washed away, faced a federal court, the soaked and warped ledger, with Mara's steady testimony, was enough. With Judge Wheeler already in custody and implicating Pike to save himself, the entire Argent Crown conspiracy crumbled. The company's charter was revoked. Its assets, the mines, the equipment, the black-painted coach, were seized by the U.S. Marshals. The town of Kestrel Ridge, which had held its breath for 3 years, finally exhaled. Change came, not as a flood, but as a steady, controlled stream, just like the water from the new spillway. The farmers, led by the men from Juniper Flats, formed the Redwater Basin Cooperative. With the territorial court's blessing, they were granted first rights to the water they had always owned. The seized assets of the Argent Crown were auctioned. The proceeds, a staggering sum of thousands of dollars, placed into a compensation fund. Its first payment was to the widows and orphans of Juniper Flats, ensuring their future. Mercy Doolin's boarding house was full again. The farmers, coming into town for supplies, and the new surveyors, honest ones hired by the cooperative, needed beds. Mercy, her hands still raw but her eyes bright, repaired the damage Rourke had done. But she did not fix everything. She took the kerosene lantern she had thrown at Pike, the one Asher had doused with the bell water, and she hung it from a hook over her front door. Its glass was shattered, a spider web of cracks, its metal frame blackened and bent. It was ugly, and it was the most beautiful thing in town. It was a monument. It was a reminder that sometimes, to bring the light, you had to be willing to start the fire. Mara's life changed. The telegraph office was no longer just her sanctuary. It became the town's voice. She did not just tap out shipping manifests. She started a community board, posting the daily water levels from the dam, the market prices from Denver, and news from the outside world. She went further. She started a class, 2 nights a week, in the back room of the saloon. She taught the ranchers, their wives, and even young Finn Abernathy, the language of the wire. She taught them Morse. She was giving them the key, ensuring that never again would one person be able to control the flow of truth. She was making the town immune to men like Pike, building a network of information that was owned by everyone. Asher, his side healing into a long, red scar, found his own peace. He returned to his shack in Dawnbreak Canyon, but not to hide. He gathered his old, whiskey-stained maps, the ones that had been his guilt, and he rolled them up. He did not burn them. He put them in a deep wooden chest, and on top of them, he placed the heavy Whitworth revolver. He closed the lid and turned the key. He was not that man anymore. He got out his tools, but he was not surveying for ore or planning diversions. He was drawing maps of life. He worked for the cooperative now. He sat at a clean drafting table, and with his precise, beautiful lines, he mapped the new irrigation channels. He drew the lines that would bring the water from the main river to the thirsty fields of the Redwater Basin. He was, line by line, undoing the sin he had written onto the land. He was drawing a map of the valley's redemption, and his own. The land itself healed. That fall, the first green blush returned to the basin. It was not the lush paradise it had once been, but it was a start. The willows along the creek bed, which had been gray skeletons, sprouted new, tender leaves. The sunsets changed. They were no longer the brassy, angry reds of a sky choked with dust. The air was clean, and the evening settled in soft shades of pearl and violet. In the new quiet pools of the Gallows Bend River, a homesteader's thin cattle stood knee-deep, their dark reflections a perfect, unbroken mirror on the surface of the water. Mara and Asher did not stay in town. The noise, the gratitude, the constant reminders of the trial. It was too much. As the first cold wind of autumn began to blow, they rode south, back to the one place that felt like their own. They returned to the lone juniper cabin. It was no longer a desperate hideout. They patched the roof, mended the door, and replaced the glass in the single window. It was small, isolated, and perfect. The air smelled of the high pines, of damp earth, and of the wood smoke that now rose, a steady, peaceful plume, from the chimney. One evening, as the crickets, a sound that had been absent for 2 years, began their nightly song, they stood by the small iron stove. Asher had just brought in an armload of wood. Mara was putting away the dishes from their simple meal. He came to stand behind her. He did not grab her. He just placed his hands on her waist, resting them there. A quiet question. She leaned back against his chest, her hands coming up to cover his. They stood like that for a long moment, simply breathing together, listening to the night. She turned in his arms. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear, the old hollowness gone. She looked at him, her face, which had been so hard, so tight with grief and anger for so long, now soft in the firelight. He kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of the storm. It was not the hesitant, discovery kiss of their first night. This was a kiss of arrival. It was slow and deep, and it spoke of a profound, shared peace. It was a promise of the morning. It was as quiet and as certain as a prayer. They did not speak of forever. They had no need for the grand, empty words of vows. Their commitment was written in the small, daily acts of a shared life. It was the way he rose first to start the coffee, saving her the last, best half cup. It was the way she mended the tear in his good coat, the stitches this time small and precise, not the crude work of a battlefield. It was his hand, finding hers. As they passed in the narrow doorway, it was her notes, scribbled in the margins of the town ledger. Asher, check the spring at marker 22, a public acknowledgement of their private partnership. On the small shelf above the stove, next to the tin of coffee, sat a small glass jar. Inside it, resting on a piece of clean wool, was the stained $20 double eagle. They had found it in her pocket, caked with mud, after the chase. It was not a trophy. It was a reminder. It was the physical proof that justice did not always come from a bullet. Sometimes it came from a choice. That night, as Asher slept, his breathing deep and steady beside her, Mara could not. She rose, wrapping the wool blanket around her, and sat at the small table. From the telegraph office, faint on the clear night air, she could hear the rhythmic, clicking pulse of the wire, a sound she had once associated with her grief. Now, it was just a sound. Kestrel Ridge secure, water levels holding. Good night. She pulled out a new ledger, one she had bought for the cabin. It was blank. She opened it to the very last page. She picked up the pencil, and in the soft lamplight, she wrote. When he slid the gold coin across the table, I said, I'd rather die. It turns out, I had just chosen to live and to love to the very end. Thank you for listening to this story. Please let us know what you thought in the comments, and tell us where you are listening from in the world. We would love to connect with you. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.